I do not know if victory is possible. I only know that great sacrifice will be required. And because the fate of many will depend on a few, we must make a last stand.
Yo, what it do, y'all? I'm your host, Will. Welcome back to Fandom Frequency, where we get into the entire multiverse of pop culture, and we're getting into the Marvel corner of the universe, baby. That's right. And don't get fooled by the shirt. We're not talking about Avengers. We're going to be talking about the X-Men, baby. The Last Stand. X3, as I like to say. The culmination of the original 2000s X-Men trilogy. Man, this is going to be a doozy to get into, that is for sure. Make sure you're clicking those buttons below the video and showing that mad love for the channel. We appreciate each and every one of you watchers and all you supporters and people that are a part of this awesome community. But we're trying to grow it, man, so make sure you join today. We're trying to get this thing bigger than the mutant community at large, man. Come on, y'all, let's do it. But we're going to be getting into one of the more controversial entries in the series, one of the most hated entries in the series, and at one time was actually my least favorite X-Men entry, and we're talking about Last Stand, of course. And when I was a youngin', back in May 26, 2006, went to go see this movie with my mom, actually, and I was so excited because X2 was like the best thing since sliced bread back then. Other than Spider-Man 2, that was far and away like the best comic book movie ever made at the time. Like, honestly, like in 2006, for sure. X2, in my opinion, was the best comic book movie ever made, in my opinion, at that time. We have way too many movies to debate and discuss these days. I don't even know what my answer is anymore. But at the time, it was X2, Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man 1, X-Men, Blade. That was like the top 5 superhero movies ever made. Maybe Batman 1 at the time I might have threw in there with Tim Burton. Keaton, baby. But that was like the shit. So everyone and their grandma was excited for X-Men The Last Stand. The teaser trailer seemed cool. I was like, oh, they're doing this crazy storyline with Jean Grey. And I remember seeing a little bit of the Dark Phoenix stuff in the animated show, but they always showed them out of order, so I never really knew where that storyline went or what was the cause of it or what really was the thing going on. But it was really interesting seeing Jean Grey turn evil. I was like, man, that's an interesting element or an interesting idea for a story of a member of a superhero team going off the rails and going evil and turning bad. Now I know they had did the whole Green Lantern thing with the Parallax storyline. You know what I'm saying? I know they had did Under the Red Hood by this point. I wasn't aware of these stories at that time, so this was a whole brand new concept to me. And and another thing, these all came out 3 years apart from each other, these original X-Men films. So in 2000, when the first one came out, I didn't see it in theaters at the time, but I was turning 6 years old at the time when that movie first dropped. And by the time I watched it, I was 6 or 7 years old. So I was 6 or 7 for the first one. I was 8, turning 9 years old for the second film. So I definitely kind of got into the story and was able to relate to the characters just a little bit more and follow the plot more closely than I did on the first X-Men film. So a little bit more of the character stuff definitely meant more to me. So by the time we got to this third movie in 2006, where I had watched the first 2 Spider-Man movies, really understood how you really are supposed to continue character arcs, and I understood how that was going. We had seen the prequel Star Wars trilogy, so I understood, when you have a storyline from point A to point B, you need to see things through and make it as a satisfying conclusion. We all knew Anakin was going to become Vader by the end of it, and to see the betrayal of it, while not perfectly executed, at least felt satisfying enough by the end of Revenge of the Sith a year prior. So going into this film, I was expecting the same thing. Okay, we're going to get Jean Grey turning evil. We're going to get this big payoff and figure out why and get the whole struggle. And then the whole mutants Akira storyline that they took directly from Joss Whedon's run in the early 2000 X-Men comics as well, because before he became a huge screenwriter, he had just did Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the late 90s and was starting to get more steam as a writer and starting to do more comic books as well. That Cure storyline was a big one in the X-Men run that he did in the comics. And for whatever reason, the producers at Fox wanted to use this storyline in the film as opposed to letting Simon Kinberg and the other writer, Zach Penn, just focus strictly on getting this thing going. So we'll get a little bit more into that in the behind the scenes stuff, but man, but just getting into this film, we had a lot of buildup, a lot of anticipation, and I just couldn't wait to see what was going to happen with my X-Men and see how this thing was going to turn out. And there was this big war with Magneto and the evil mutants, and where was it all going to go? Where do the humans fall into this? I was just so excited to see the culmination of these first two awesome-ass movies come to be. And that was the first time in my movie-going experience that I ever went to a movie and was extremely disappointed. I was so disappointed. I hated the movie at the time. I hated it. I was 11 years old, about to turn 12. I hated it, man. I was like, my mom actually had a pretty good time with the movie because she didn't know much about it, so she thought it was just an entertaining sci-fi movie, really. But for me, it was completely lackluster. It was completely lacking. The only thing I thought that was good about the movie was the end fight with everyone, with Magneto's side versus the X-Men. That was the only thing about the movie I liked. I didn't like anything else. Oh, and the beginning scene in the danger room. That was fucking rad, getting to see them go against Sentinels, Kitty Pryde in full effect, who was also one of my other favorite side characters in X-Men. Getting introduced to Elliot Page, who was Ellen Page at the time, and her great acting ability, their great acting ability, however you want to say it, whatever. But yeah, so it was really cool in the beginning, but by the middle and the rest of the movie, I was like, what the fuck is this, man? You just killed off Professor X. That's fucked up. And you killed off Cyclops off screen. What the hell is going on here? I thought they had a whole love story going on, and you threw it away within 3 minutes. And he only had 4 minutes of screen time in this whole fucking movie, man. They completely fucked it up, and we'll get more into that in a minute and why, but jeez Louise. Like, they completely wasted a lot of the storylines that were going on. The only storyline that worked was Wolverine having to kill Jean Grey and the whole tragic thing of that. And him being in love with her and the whole thing. That was the only thing in the movie that worked. And them missing Professor X, because you did feel like that was their father, and you felt the connection with him and the whole student body of the Gifted Youngsters School. So those are the only two elements of the story that worked. Everything else felt stupid, or I didn't care about it because it was a bunch of politics shit that I was 11 years old, so I wasn't really as invested in it in the same way because it wasn't as well written or presented. And they were bringing in these new characters I had no ties to. Bolivar Trask is a big character from the comics, but I didn't care about that at the time with the one dude from The Predator. Didn't care. The President character was just the one-note, same mutant-hating character that we always got to get from these movies with, like Senator Kelly in the first X-Men film. So all that just felt very formulaic and been there, done that. So it was just very disappointing. I did like the costumes. I did like the effects. It was funny to see Juggernaut yell, "I'm the Juggernaut, bitch," and run through a couple walls and stuff. Kitty Pryde got to do some cool shit. And you even got a second love triangle between him and Rogue a little bit, which I thought was kind of interesting in a fun way, where if it was more well written, that would have been a good way to kind of replicate and kind of mirror Cyclops and Jean Grey in a soap opera kind of way that would make sense with X-Men, because it is a soap opera. It's an ongoing thing a little bit, That would have played a little bit better for me. But they didn't even do that good. And then Rogue was barely even in the goddamn movie. Now, that's behind the scenes reasons why. I didn't know this at the time. But still, as an ongoing and cinematic experience, it's lame. So I didn't like that shit at the time. One thing I will spoil a little bit for the review section of this before I get into that in a minute. I have come around to this movie a bit more than I used to. I'm not saying this is a great film by any means. So don't start clicking the dislikes and start putting in the angry comments. Hold on a minute. I'm not saying that X-Men The Last Stand is top tier X-Men, but I'm just saying it's not bottom of the barrel, and I don't hate it as much as I used to when I was a young 11-year-old kid. So that's all I'm trying to say. I do have a little bit of a different perspective of the film now, and I think it has aged a little better than people give it credit for. But we'll get into that in a moment. Let's get into some of the behind the scenes and figure out what the fuck happened and why this thing turned into such a shit show of a script at the end of the day. Now, a lot of this stuff all stemmed from the fact that they wanted to get this film out in 2006, and they wanted Bryan Singer to come back and do it, but Warner Brothers had courted him to do a whole Superman series and let him take the reins and do it after they saw the success he had with the first two X-Men movies, especially with X2 being the most profitable superhero movie at the time and one of the most profitable blockbusters of all time. And by the way, to this day, X-Men is the number 4 highest grossing superhero franchise, right behind the MCU, Spider-Man, and Batman. So that's pretty fucking huge. So Singer decided to jump at the opportunity to take on the Man of Steel and do his own interpretation of a continuation from the Christopher Reeve run and do Superman Returns, which came out, I think, the next year in '07, which also turned out to be a huge disappointment. Not that it was a shittily, not that it was a shitty script or anything, but it just was dull and lacked any sense of impact or any sense of hype with the fans, and wasn't a financial success either. So it was just a big disappointment on both fronts. So he could have came back to the trilogy that he started, but he didn't, and he tried to start his own, and then that turned out to be a shit show. Kind of reminds me a little bit of the Star Wars stuff going on right now, but I digress. That's a thing for another day. Another interesting fact was one of the guys that came in and actually saved the X-Men franchise in the sense of creatively and for the hardcore fan base. Matthew Vaughn was actually hired at one time to take on the directing duties of this movie. He even storyboarded the entire thing, according to him in an interview recently. They were a few weeks away from getting things going, apparently. But the studio system got so meddling in everything he was trying to do to set the film up, he decided to part ways because he just felt like he couldn't get his creative vision off the ground and felt like Fox just wasn't, they didn't understand what made these films so great to begin with and were just chasing the bag and didn't really see the value in creating a really good continuation and a satisfying conclusion for the stories and respecting the material like they had before while making kick-ass movies. That's why those films were successful to begin with. X-Men 1 and 2 understood what makes a great film, understood what makes an entertaining blockbuster, and understood what Marvel fans wanted from the characters enough to create great stories, but not let them dictate the story. This one, they just did whatever they could and threw whatever they could at the wall to try to get it to meet their deadlines because the filmmaking process just wasn't going well. They had Simon Kinberg and Zach Penn through the entire process to write the script, but they had to keep constantly rewriting and changing things as the director's chair and as things kept changing in the whole development process. So that just totally fucked up things and got in the way. And with them changing directors, Matthew Vaughn leaving, Bryan Singer not available, with them constantly changing the vision of the script, that ended up creating scheduling conflicts with a lot of the main actors of the movie. Namely, James Marsden is Scott Summers, a.k.a. Cyclops, and Anna Paquin is Rogue in this whole thing. Those two barely had any screen time at any time in the movie because they were both shooting other things. James Marsden actually was over there working on Superman Returns with Bryan Singer. And Anna Paquin, I think, was working on like True Blood or something like that. So they both were working on different things and were kind of rising in their stardom, and they ended up barely having any roles in the movie. Obviously, Scott Summers got killed off in one of the most unceremonious ways I've ever seen for a fictional character from a franchise or some kind of IP ever since. And this movie came out fucking 16 years ago, something like that. Yeah, 17 years ago, and it's still one of the worst unceremonious deaths I've ever seen in science fiction, man. It's fucking stupid. And then they kill Professor X in a somewhat better way, but I felt like they didn't build up enough of the whole relationship and the whole conflict with Jean Grey and Charles Xavier. Like, they totally rushed it through and had him acting completely out of character, yelling at people, manipulating people, and having them go into situations he knows they can't win. It did not feel like Professor X whatsoever, and it was terrible, man. Like, I don't know why they went in that direction with it, and that's the thing. I do have some entertainment value with the movie. There are some redeeming qualities to it, but a lot of this behind-the-scenes shit was just getting in the way, man. And this is where studio meddling goes in the wrong direction, because sometimes it's good and helps someone to approach the film in a different way and make it better for an audience and make it better for an overall package. This was not that case at all. So they totally fucked it up. Now, the one cool thing that actually did come through in the behind the scenes was that Halle Berry actually insisted on them giving her more stunt work to do, because she had the cape, she had the whole getup, she had went through so many things on the first film, throwing up from all the wire work and all that stuff. She felt like she put so much work into the first film. In the second film, she felt like she got a little shortchanged in that respect. So even though she got to do some more dramatic and good dialogue-driven scenes, she didn't really get to do any of the cool storm action. So this one, she really insisted on them writing that in there and getting her in to do that. And they did so. And other than the real weird spin-toppy kind of weird move they did there in the Jean Grey scene where they're going to attack her at her old childhood home and whatnot and try to stop her, that felt a little cartoonish. But overall, the action was pretty good with Storm in this one. So that is one positive I'll give it from the behind-the-scenes meddling that they did do. And it's pretty crazy, too, because this film had a $210 million budget, which seems almost quaint nowadays, but was the most expensive film ever made at that time in the mid 2000s, which totally blows my mind that that was the most expensive film ever made at the time. But it does make sense because Transformers hadn't taken off yet. Pirates of the Caribbean was barely back. Spider-Man was in full swing. Batman was barely back with Batman Begins the year prior, so we barely got Batman in good standing. Superman was dead in the water and hadn't fucked up yet with Superman Returns, but didn't bounce back yet either, and still kind of hasn't fully bounced back. We're in 2024, guys, and we haven't had an all-around, highly successful and well-received Superman film yet. Since that film, it's almost 20 years, guys. Holy shit, man. It's a crazy storm that Hollywood is. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, man. So all that stuff was going on. And yeah, so it's just so much weird turmoil was going on behind the scenes. And they ended up getting Brett Ratner to direct the film. And the only thing he was really known for doing was the Rush Hour films, I think 1 and 2 at that point. And he didn't mind having to work under a tight deadline. He just kind of fused things together and just kind of went with it and kind of just put together whatever was going to work and make the most entertaining film that they could to meet the deadline. And that ended up totally undercutting a lot of the drama and the character stuff that happens in the movie, man. So didn't get as much behind the scenes drama. We all knew there had to be some shit show stuff going on in order to create the film that we saw, but just figured I'd get into it a little bit for the If You Don't Know, Now You Know segment of this X-Men review series. So getting into my overall review of the film and getting into kind of what I alluded to earlier in the first part of this, I do have more fun with this movie than I used to. I do think that it plays a little better and has aged better than we initially perceived it in 2006. Was it still a disappointing end to a fucking trilogy? Hell yeah. Is it still disappointing in general as an X-Men movie? Sure. But is it at least competently made? For the most part, yes. There is some scripting issues here. There is some directing choices that I think are a little bit odd and don't really make sense. But when you know the full context of it, it does kind of make sense at the same time why it's like that. But I will say this. The actors still give it their all. The Kira storyline does play into themes from the first two movies and does play well and actually plays better than the Dark Phoenix storyline, which is the one thing I'll give a plus. The one thing that the studio forced in there, Brett Ratner, Simon Kinberg, and Zach Penn, especially as the more competent side of this thing with the writing, really did go out of their way to create a coherent, as coherent a script as they could around the studio meddling and all the notes that they got. I do think they did a fairly admirable job at keeping some things consistent with what was going on in the film in and of itself and with the trilogy in and of itself. It's kind of like the Colin Trevorrow Star Wars script, if it actually got made for them. It was kind of their thing they did for X-Men. It still tied into what was going on. It just didn't do some of the stuff that they should have did with it and kind of shortchanged elements that would have made this film its own entity and made it stick out a lot more, like the Dark Phoenix storyline, which is in and of itself its own trilogy if you really look at it. So the way that they kind of rushed that and made that an afterthought, really stupid, but the Kira storyline actually works pretty well in and of itself. Ian McKellen as Magneto in this one I thought was actually pretty damn compelling as well, leading the charge and going gung-ho into, into going into war with the humans and any mutants that stand in their way. Definitely felt very Magneto and very true to the character from the movies and the comics. So I will give him credit where credit is due. The whole end and the tragic ending of Wolverine being the only one with the ability to take Jean out and being the only one that can kill the one that he loves was really sad, and it actually played well with the way that he was able to act out the moment. I thought it was really well done. Honestly, I really did. The death of Charles Xavier actually does have some weight to it, actually does have impact. And you do feel for the X-Men and for the team. And you do have a sense of like, oh no, Charles, damn, he's gone. Like Professor X is gone, you know? Like you really do feel that loss and you really do feel it. I think they still could have added more to the script to make it feel even more impactful through the third act and really feel the vengeance or really feel them fighting for him and fighting for Scott, but you don't. So that's the stuff with this movie where there's some emotion and some things that hit, but it doesn't follow through by the end because Brett Ratner and them just rushed too much through it in order to give you that satisfying conclusion from point A to point B all the way through for all the characters. The one thing I will say that sometimes has been a little bit of a detriment to comic book movies these days, but at this time wasn't beaten into the ground as much and actually was more of a welcome thing at the time because we didn't get a lot of this quite yet, and I think was more of the saving grace of a more sloppily written film, was all the cool character cameos and fan service. We got Jubilee cameos. Angel has a role in this film, played by the great Ben Foster. There's a lot of really cool like Easter eggs like that. Juggernaut coming into this thing. Kitty Pryde having a role. A lot of this stuff. The Cure from the comic book storyline, an actual real comic storyline that actually held weight with the themes of the movies that they already had created. There were some really cool things that they were pulling from in the X-Men lore in order to put into this one. Kelsey Grammer being cast as Beast. How could I not mention that? That was brilliant casting. I thought he did a phenomenal job as Hank McCoy, aka Beast. Phenomenal. The makeup and everything, it looked fantastic. I thought it was awesome. So there are some good things to this. There is some good casting here with, like I said, Elliot Page as Kitty Pryde, with Kelsey Grammer as Storm, with Ben Foster as Angel. There was some cool stuff there and some really cool fan service and some awesome moments. The Danger Room sequence, so fucking rad, but just sloppily written and put together and very, very rushed. And like I said, when you have things like X-Men Apocalypse, which completely shit the bed on an even more epic storyline, almost in a sense, not more iconic, but a more epic storyline, and a more epic, more mainstay, huge villain presence. Almost the only other one outside of either Magneto, Mr. Sinister, or the Dark Phoenix is that of Apocalypse. Amazing casting that they completely wasted. I'm telling you, man, it sucked. And the movie in and of itself doesn't suck entirely, but there's definitely some elements to this movie that definitely sucks. And it's a very, very mixed bag, but X-Men Apocalypse to me is barely even passable. And Dark Phoenix is so fucking dull, it's very forgettable. I only have a real emotional experience that ties me to when I went to see the film that I'll get into later. And that's the only reason why I remember my experience of going to see Dark Phoenix. Not the movie, but who I saw it with and the meaning that it has to me in retrospect of that 5 years ago. So that's what I mean. They've never been able to do the Dark Phoenix story justice outside of the animated realm or comic books. So I'm hoping maybe if they ever do it again, maybe they'll get it right. But yeah, they definitely rushed this thing too much, and it definitely was a very unsatisfying conclusion to the X-Men trilogy. But almost 20 years later, watching it for this review series in a marathon sense, it does play a little bit better. It is watchable. It is entertaining. There are some fun quips. It is a lot of really cool fan service, and they do embrace the more comic booky elements of the comic accurate costumes in this film, which does make it cool. It's black leather, but everyone has their own color scheme and something a little bit different going on. So I do appreciate that. Pyro gets a really cool upgrade with his costume and shit. So, and the third act has a really badass fight. So it's not all bad, but I do think that it definitely warranted the hate at the time, but definitely deserves a little bit more credit in the grand scheme of things in the almost 20 years since, because we've gotten way worse comic book movies, not just in its own franchise, but in the genre as a whole. And we've had much worse blockbusters, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. So I do think X-Men The Last Stand does stand a little bit above the pack as opposed to some of these more disappointing sequels. But I do think it's still in the pack of disappointing sequels, just probably in the top 3 to 5 of those, not the bottom ring. But overall, it's okay. But I do look back on my time watching the movie with some laughs, and I do have a fondness for being able to see the original X-Men trilogy for the most part when it hit theaters and originally during its original run, and being able to grow with the fandom and kind of go along the ride and with the journey with the cast and crew all the way to the end of this thing. So I do have kind of some fun looking at it in that way. But let me know what you thought about this thing back in the day if you're around my age or older and saw it then. Let me know what you think about watching it now. Do you want to see any of these characters from The Last Stand come back in new versions and new castings of the MCU? Do you want them to do the Cure storyline again? Or would you prefer them to do Dark Phoenix as its own saga and its own set of movies, man? Maybe even do like a phase with just a bunch of X-Men movies mostly tying in and leading up to that and setting those things up. How do you want to see it? What do you think about this film? Which one's your favorite in this original X-Men trilogy? Is it X2? Is it this one for some weird reason? Or is it the original X-Men? Let me know what you think about that down in the comments below. We do have our previous reviews for X2 and X-Men up on the channel. Go ahead and click that right there, that little card in the corner. We're going to have the playlist for all these X-Men reviews as we continue through the review series leading up to Deadpool 3, a.k.a. Deadpool and Wolverine, July 26, 2024. We're going to have our big old spoiler discussion, spoiler-free reviews, and all that weekend. And we're going to have these reviews coming at you just about every week or every couple weeks each month leading up, all 13 installments leading up to Deadpool and Wolverine. So make sure you don't miss it. Click the buttons below the video so you're along for the ride and a part of this dope, awesome community. We got some other music and movie-related content coming into the channel this week. We've got our long-form podcast, The Phantom Frequency Show, going to be dropping every week. We got another episode of that dropping, and we got some really cool content coming for y'all. Around the time that this video should be dropping, we should be right around Ghostbusters Frozen Empire. We're going to have a big old spoiler review for that. And yeah, so make sure you stay tuned. Don't sleep on any of this dopeness. Appreciate you for watching and sticking around to the end. And we'll catch you again real soon for Wolverine Origins. That's going to be fun. And until then, peace out, y'all.